Okay, it looks like it's going to take me at least 2 videos to finish Nietzsche. So the next video will be the conclusion. It'll be a little bit shorter than all the previous ones, I'm hoping. We'll see how it goes. But so in this one, we're picking up right where we left off. We're talking about the 2 spectators that Euripides was concerned with, not the public at large, but one of them, we already learned in the previous video, was himself, okay? We'll get to the second one in this video as well. We're also going to, by the end of the video, talk a little bit about the relationship between Greek tragedy and philosophy, particularly the philosophy of Plato and Socrates, and how those sort of mesh a bit. And Socrates is also a bit responsible for the death of tragedy. But let's just start again. We're going to reread this quote we ended on the last video with, right? Again, of the 2 spectators, one is Euripides himself, right? So he's this last tragic poet who kills tragedy. And we talked in the previous video sort of some of the elements, and get into more details in this one, some of the elements of his tragic work that were antithetical, Nietzsche thinks, to what really made Greek tragedy great. And so partly he was concerned with himself, right? Himself as a spectator when he was making his art. And we're talking about Euripides as a thinker. So the intellectual Euripides, not the artistic Euripides, okay? Sort of in intellectual mode, not as a poet. And it might be said of him that his copious fund of critical talent, right? So what was it about him? What was the spectator in him, was the critic in him? If it did not create, at least it constantly stimulated a corresponding and productive artistic impulse. So he did bring things forth. He was productive, okay? In fact, I think we know more about him and more works have survived than the other 2 tragic poets who Nietzsche mentioned, Sophocles and Aeschylus. So who knows? Perhaps he was one of the more productive, but Nietzsche has very little regard, it seems, for his art. But what was the problem? How was Euripides a spectator, and what type of spectator was he as a thinker? This passage here sheds a little bit of light on that. How did he approach tragedy, his own tragedy and the tragedy of others? He looked at the old tragic poets, and this is sort of his reaction, according to Nietzsche. How dubious remained the solution of the ethical problems, how questionable the treatment of the myths, how unequal the distribution of good and bad fortune. In the very language of the old tragedy, there was much that was objectionable to him, or at least puzzling. Especially he encountered too much pomp for simple affairs, too many tropes and monstrous expressions to suit the plainness of the characters. So he sat in the theater, pondering uneasily. As a spectator, he confessed to himself that he did not understand his great predecessors. If, however, it was his opinion that the understanding was the essential root of all enjoyment and creation, he must inquire, he must look to see whether anyone else had the same opinion, whether they also felt this incommensurability. But most people, among them the finest individuals, answered him only with a distrustful smile, while none could explain why the great masters were still in the right, despite his scruples and objections. And in this state of torment, he found that other spectator who did not comprehend tragedy and therefore did not esteem it. Allied with him in solitary state, he could now venture to begin the terrific struggle against the art of Aeschylus and Sophocles, not as polemist, but as dramatic poet himself. So it wasn't a polemist, wasn't an arguer. He actually partook in this art form himself against them. And he opposes his own conception of tragedy to the traditional one. And it was the Dionysian element, really, that Euripides seemed to have the most animosity or puzzlement is probably a better word. He couldn't understand the Dionysian in it. Is the Dionysian entitled to exist at all? Should it not be forcibly uprooted from Hellenic soil? Certainly, the poet tells us, if it were only possible. But the god Dionysus is too powerful. His most intelligent adversary, like Pentheus in the Bacchae, is unwittingly enchanted by him, and in this enchantment runs to meet his fate, okay? So Euripides helps tragedy commit suicide, right? Runs to meet his own fate. And what it is he tries to banish Dionysus from poetry, from art. Nietzsche says you can't do that. We've talked about that enough, I think, in previous videos, so I won't dwell on it too much here, right? By trying to uproot the Dionysian element, he fails. And his last work, Euripides, I suppose, Nietzsche sort of putting forth as a testament to this, as evidence for this, that Euripides ends up writing about Dionysus in the Bacchae. Dionysus is the main character. Pentheus is the king who learns his lesson, right? Who crosses the path of Dionysus, who doesn't take Dionysius serious. And this is a pretty violent play, right? If you've ever read the Bacchae, it's pretty violent even by today's standards, right? The king is, concerned, who is this foreigner? All the women are going mad and crazy and running through the countryside, including my wife. And all of his sort of counselors and everybody, you gotta respect this guy. And he doesn't. He actually imprisons Dionysus. And Dionysus apparently gives him a few chances to recant, and he doesn't. And he pays the price. Again, pretty violent. Dionysus makes him do some really ridiculous and then violent, kind of horrifying things by the end of the play. Okay, this is Euripides' final play, where again Dionysus arguably is the main character. So this tragedy, the Bacchae, is a protest against the practicability of his own tendency, Euripides' own tendency, right? Trying to remove the Dionysian element. He ends up writing a play about Dionysus. But alas, it's already been put to practice, right? He's tried to do this, obviously, for Nietzsche. He ultimately fails, but what he does succeed at is destroying an art form, right? Destroying the art form of Greek tragedy. The surprising thing had happened when the poet recanted. His tendency had already conquered. Dionysus had already been scared from the tragic stage. He'd been scared by a demonic power speaking through Euripides. For even Euripides was, in a sense, only a mask. The deity that spoke through him was neither Dionysus nor Apollo. It was an altogether newborn demon. It was called Socrates, okay, Socrates. So now we get to the second spectator, right? The first was Euripides himself. The second, Socrates, okay? That's what's driving this Socratic element, right? We've got the Dionysian element, the Apollonian element in art, and now we've got this new thing, this new beast, Socrates. And Euripides was, I guess, in sort of similar agreement with him, right? Had a similar perspective on art. Found in him a fellow traveler, right? A kindred spirit. That's what I was looking for. So what's going on with this new development? Right? We talked about in earlier videos the Apollonian creed that drives Apollonian art, art with a more Apollonian emphasis. The Olympian Homeric epic. Then you've got the Dionysian creed we talked about, and sort of the Greek tragedy is one that adheres to the Dionysian creed. But what is the new Socratic creed? Right, we have this new antithesis, the Dionysian and the Socratic, and on that antithesis, the art of Greek tragedy was wrecked. So remember, the Apollonian creeds were know thyself and nothing too much, right? Nothing in excess. The Dionysian, everything is unity and individuation is evil, right? The Greek tragedy was supposed to be this communal exercise where one lost oneself, became one with the characters of the stage, lost the sense of individuality and subjectivity, the sort of ecstatic experience of art. But for aesthetic Socratism, that's what we just call in this, what is its creed, right? Its supreme law reads as follows: to be beautiful, everything must be intelligible, and knowledge is virtue, right? So just like when we talk about this quote here, when Euripides is a spectator, it seems like his opinion is that the understanding is the essential root of all enjoyment and creation. So because he can't understand the play, he's like not understanding why did this person act this way, and Why did he get punished? He seems like a good guy. It doesn't make sense, you know, it doesn't understand, it's not rational. For him, it has to make sense to be enjoyed, right? To be good, to be beautiful, right? This is the new Socratic creed. To be beautiful, everything must be intelligible. Knowledge is virtue. So with this canon in his hand, Euripides measures all the separate elements of the drama, language, characters, dramaturgic structure, and choric music, and corrects them according to this principle. The poetic deficiency and degeneration, which we so often want to impute to Euripides in comparison with Sophocles. He really didn't like Euripides, right? This is for the most part the product of this penetrating critical process, this daring intelligibility, okay? Right, so that's why Euripides is a deficient artist. That's why his art is not as good as Sophocles. That's why he lacks the beauty of the poetry of Sophocles, at least in Nietzsche's opinion here, is because this is what his guiding principle, right? He has to make everything intelligent, right? Intelligible, right? It's a product of this penetrating critical process, right? He's a critical artist, right? Not a Dionysian or Apollonian, sort of a Socratic artist. The Euripidean prologue may serve as an example of the results of this rationalistic method, right? If you do read his plays, that's one thing that struck me, you know, even before I sort of tied it to Nietzsche. I remember reading Euripides and thinking about, you know, the prologue. You got one guy that walks out on stage and reads it's long, and I'm just thinking, somebody had to memorize all that stuff. I think they were wearing masks, so maybe he somehow wrote all the words in them. I mean, geez. How could you? But they're long. It's a long, drawn-out prologue. So Nietzsche talks about this, right? The prologue might serve as an example of the results of this rationalistic method. Nothing could be more antithetical to the technique of our own stage than the prologue in the drama of Euripides. For a single person to appear at the outset of the play, telling us who he is, what precedes the action, what has happened so far, and even what will happen in the course of the play, would be condemned by a modern playwright as willful, inexcusable abandonment of the effect of suspense, right? So a modern playwright would look at this and say, this is ridiculous. Again, you know, you're telling everybody what's going to happen before it happens. Who's going to want to watch it? But that's not why it was bad in this context, right? It was different. Back in the Greek stage, they knew those myths. They knew the story, right? They knew the story of Oedipus. They knew the story of Prometheus. They knew what was going to happen before it happened. So there was a different reason why this wasn't artful, right? We know everything that is going to happen. Who cares to wait until it actually does happen? Considering, moreover, that here we do not by any means have the exciting relation of the prophetic dream to a reality taking place later on. That's review the Apollonian to sort of get a sense of what he means there. The effect of tragedy never depended on epic suspense. Again, people knew about the stories already, on a fascinating uncertainty as to what is to happen now and afterwards, but rather on the great rhetorical lyric scenes in which the passion and dialectic of the chief hero swelled to a broad and mighty stream. Everything was directed towards pathos, so developing a sense of, you know, emotional or, you know, visceral kind of attachment, right? Appealing to the passions. So everything was directed towards pathos, not action. And whatever was not directed towards pathos was considered objectionable. But what interferes with the listener's pleasurable satisfaction in such scenes is a missing link, a gap in the texture of the previous history. So long as the spectator has to divine the meaning of this or that person, of the presuppositions of this or that conflict of views and inclinations, his complete absorption in the activities and sufferings of the chief characters is impossible, as is likewise breathless fellow feeling and fellow fearing, right? So the Greek tragedy, right, the point wasn't, you know, suspense about what's going to happen to these characters, right, but rather, and he elaborates it on here in this quote, right, and the Aeschylean, Sophoclean tragedy, right, Aeschylus, Sophoclean tragedy, they employed the most ingenious devices in the initial scenes to place in the spectator's hands, as if by chance, all the threads necessary for a complete understanding, a trait whereby that noble artistry is approved, which as it were masks the inevitably formal element and makes it appear as something accidental. This is kind of a confusing passage, but he's saying something very similar to Aristotle. For those of you who are students of mine from U of H who are watching this for my Philosophy in the Arts class, if you remember in class when we were talking about Aristotle and the way the tragedy is supposed to be constructed, how you're supposed to construct the plot, everything is supposed to happen as if it was supposed to happen that way, but at the same time it's supposed to make it seem, like it was accidental, right? Everything that follows is an inevitable result of the preceding action, but it's done in such an artful way that it's still kind of like, oh wow, it's cool how they did that. It's still, it made sense that it worked out that way, but it comes off as accidental. Notwithstanding this, Euripides thought he observed that during these first scenes, the spectator was so peculiarly anxious to make out the problem of the previous history that the poetic beauties and pathos of the exposition were lost to him. Right, so there's no way of Nietzsche really knowing this, right? But he's picturing Euripides sitting in the theater in these opening scenes, where, Sophocles or Aeschylus are employing these really ingenious devices to just sort of leave a few little shreds, little crumbs in the opening scenes to sort of give them just enough information so that when the really important stuff happens, the exciting stuff, they'll have what they need to understand it, right? So Nietzsche's picturing Euripides in the audience, looking around and seeing everybody kind of watching these opening scenes and kind of trying to pick up the little breadcrumbs. And instead of like understanding that, oh no, they get it, they're waiting, they're helping this sort of emotional catharsis sort of take place by sort of just relaxing and immersing themselves in the play, allowing the events to unfold and this clarity to emerge, perhaps, right? He's thinking that they're just confused, period. That's it. They're just completely confused, and we need to just sort of spell everything out for them, just sort of lay it all out on the table with a nice long prologue that explains the whole history and everything, right? So the poetic beauties and pathos of the exposition were completely lost to him, says Nietzsche, right? Thus, Euripides as a poet is essentially an echo of his own conscious knowledge, and it is precisely on this account that he occupies such a noble position in the history of Greek art. With reference to his critical productive activity, right, he's a critical artist, right, he must often have felt that he ought to make objective in drama the words at the beginning of the essay of Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras, pre-Socratic philosopher, right, ancient Greek philosopher, and here's what Anaxagoras says. In the beginning, all things were mixed together, and then came the understanding and created order. Anaxagoras with his nous, that's the Greek word for understanding or mind or ordering element. Anaxagoras with his nous is said to have appeared among philosophers as the only sober person amid a crowd of drunken ones. Euripides may also have conceived his relation to the other tragic poets under a similar figure. So Anaxagoras, a little bit about him, I don't want to get too much into it, right? But again, pre-Socratic, ancient Greek philosopher, he believed that the world itself was, again, all mixed together in the beginning, but then this mind, nous, took all the elements that were chaotic and ordered them into a nice ordered universe, okay? The very short version of his philosophy, okay? And I guess compared to someone like Heraclitus that thought the world was constantly changing and moving and it was like akin to fire, or Thales who thought everything was water in one form or another, he thought his was a more sober view. Euripides, I guess comparing himself to Aeschylus and Sophocles, thinks the same thing. So remember, Socrates is one of these other spectators he's concerned with. When Euripides is writing his plays, he's the critic of his own, right? He's got this intellectual framework, but him and Socrates are kindred spirits. The divine Plato, for the most part, speaks but ironically of the creative faculty of the poet, insofar as it is not conscious insight, and places it on par with the gift of the soothsayer and the dream interpreter. We talked about this already in my class. If you're, again, one of my students from the University of Houston, and you're taking this, you're actually watching this video as part of my philosophy in the arts class, you remember Plato, right? That the poet, the artist doesn't have knowledge, right? They don't have understanding, okay? They don't have conscious insight. They can't explain their own poems. They don't know what they just do it by inspiration. So therefore they're deficient in knowledge. They're like a soothsayer or a dream interpreter, okay? The intimation is that the poet is incapable of composing until he has become unconscious and bereft of reason. Like Plato, Euripides undertook to show to the world the reverse of the unintelligent poet. His aesthetic principle that to be beautiful, everything must be known is the parallel to the Socratic. To be good, everything must be known. So again, Socrates is the second spectator. He did not comprehend and therefore did not esteem the old tragedy, right? Just like Euripides, Socrates didn't get it. He didn't get the art behind Aeschylus and Sophocles. He was repelled by it. He didn't get particularly those Dionysian elements in the old art form. So in alliance with Euripides, he dared to be the herald of a new art, insofar as the struggle is directed against the Dionysian element in older tragedy. We may recognize in Socrates the opponent of Dionysus. He is the new Orpheus rebelling against Dionysus. And although he's destined to be torn to pieces by the Maenads of the Athenian court, yet he puts to flight the overpowerful god himself. The most decisive word ever, however, for this new and unprecedented value set upon knowledge and insight was spoken by Socrates when he found that he was the only one who acknowledged to himself that he knew nothing. For in his critical peregrinations through Athens, he called on the great statesmen, orators, poets, and artists, and everywhere he discovered the conceit of knowledge. To his astonishment, he perceived that all these celebrities were without a proper and sure insight, even with regard to their own professions, and that they practiced them only by instinct. Right? So for Socrates, the fact that the poets couldn't explain their poems, right, and that all these others couldn't understand basic concepts of justice and couldn't explain justice, and yet they were said to be statesmen, right? For him, it seemed that if they had a reputation and they truly did have wisdom, it was a kind of wisdom that was definitely not conscious wisdom. It was a sort of instinct. And for him, in that sense, it was deficient. It wasn't as good as the sort of rational, clear understanding of things. And Socrates had a demon in a certain sense, right? Daemon is, I guess, the pronunciation, the Latinized version, but his spirit, right? Oftentimes in the Platonic dialogue, Socrates will get a voice in his head, right? This is something that pops up throughout the Platonic corpus. So we're offered a key, Nietzsche argues, to the character of Socrates and his demon, right? When we hear about this, right? So to read the quote, we're offered a key to the character of Socrates by the wonderful phenomenon which he calls his demon. In exceptional circumstances, when his gigantic intellect begins to fail him, he receives a secure support in the utterances of a divine voice, which manifests itself at such moments. The voice, whenever it comes, always dissuades. In this utterly abnormal nature, instinctive wisdom appears only in order to hinder, here and there, the process of conscious perception. Whereas in productive men, right, the craftsman and the poet, right, in productive men, it is an instinct that is the creatively affirmative force and consciousness that acts critically and dissuasively. With Socrates, it is instinct that becomes critic and consciousness that becomes creator. A perfect monstrosity per defectum, right? Nietzsche does not like this, right? For him, it's a bad development in art. Of course, it's trying to push away all those Dionysian elements. The word demon here, don't be confused. It's not negative, right? I think that term daemon in Greek just maybe the same thing as spirit, aberration, or something like that, right? Something that a specter or something like this, something that for him, for me, I think it's just his conscience. Like, some scholars debate whether this is some actual phenomenon and maybe Plato just made it up, who knows? We won't get into the details of that. It's not important. For Nietzsche here, what he thinks is that this is the intuition. This is intuition. Just like I'm sort of convinced that this is intuition, but it's an intuition that doesn't. It's an instinct or an intuition that doesn't lead to creativity, but rather hinders it, rather dissuades it, is rather critical of it. Okay, and so this is the reverse of previous artistic production. In fact, this quote here, I think, is, you can see the seeds of the later Nietzsche in this stuff, right? This idea of instinct being reversed in Socrates, right? Socrates being repelled by his instinct, but at the same time, he does have an instinct, but the instinct is intellectual, right? He turns the intellect into the instinct, the critic, right? And sort of, you say, consciousness, awareness, right? I create not through inspiration, but through dialectic, through rational peregrination, I think was the word he was using, a nice fancy word, peregrination. So let's imagine the one great cyclops eye of Socrates fixed on tragedy, an eye in which the fine frenzy of artistic enthusiasm had never glowed. To this eye was denied the pleasure of gazing into the Dionysian abysses, for what it was bound to see in the sublime and greatly lauded tragic art, as Plato called it. What was it bound to see? A thing devoid of sense, full of causes apparently without effects, effects apparently without causes. The whole, moreover, so motley and diversified that though it could not be but repugnant to a thoughtful mind, it was a dangerous incentive for the sensitive and irritable souls. Remember, we talked about, if you're one of my UH students, we talked about Plato's theory of art in our class discussions, right? For him, art is dangerous, right? It can, if you're not an intellectual, thoughtful person, it can actually have an effect on the irrational parts of your soul. And we know what was the only kind of poetry that Socrates understood, the Aesopian fable, right? The tortoise and hare story, the fox and the grapes, right? They all have an easy, straight lesson, right? The slow and steady wins the race, right? Summed up, clear as day. This is what it's about. This is the kind of art that Socrates wants to promote. Okay, well, this is a good place to stop this video. I think what we're going to do is we're going to pick up here. We're right in the middle of Socrates versus tragedy. We've got some more things to say about this. We're going to talk about sort of this new Socratic art. It's kind of an oxymoronic phrase, Socratic art for Nietzsche. It's sort of Socrates almost the enemy of art, or is he? It's, there's always some subtlety to Nietzsche's thought. So we'll save that for the last and final video, which is coming up next. So stick with us for that. Thanks for sticking around till the end of this one, and hopefully we'll see you on the other side.